legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
They come from a dying world. They drift through the universe, pushed on by the solar winds. They adapt, and they survive. The function of all life is survival. Sleep, sleep, sleep. From deep space, sleep. The seed is planted. Sleep, sleep. Terror grows.
Matthew! Matthew! Matthew!
Like the others.
Elizabeth, wake up! Get you when you sleep.
It's got no detail, no character. It's unformed.
All of a sudden, they're growing like parasites. Is it contagious? People are being duplicated.
You're looking at it as if it was human. It was not human.
Greetings and welcome to this, the 400th edition of legalizefreedom.com. My guest today is Kingsley Dennis, who joins us to discuss his latest book, The Inversion, How We Have Been Tricked into Perceiving a False Reality. What we perceive in the world around us is not the hard and fast material reality which modern science insists is all there is. Not only do non-material realms vastly outnumber the narrow vision of 3 dimensions in our 5 senses, they shape the world of our everyday experience in ways that few are aware of or even consider possible. The first quarter of the 21st century has increasingly come to be dominated by dark forces which appear to be anti-human and even anti-life. The Inversion delves deep into the possible origin and nature of these forces, which through social, cultural, political and economic means are fostering mass psychosis and self-destruction in our species, and through the advent of transhumanism and artificial intelligence, seeking to eliminate the human race completely. Hello and welcome, Kingsley, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg. It's always good to be chatting with you and good to be back again.
Today, Kingsley, we're talking about your latest book, The Inversion, How We Have Been Tricked into Perceiving a False Reality. For listeners who don't know, I'll get you to offer a quick potted bio, a little bit of information about yourself and your work. However, this is a very notable event today, certainly for me, but also in the years that we've been speaking. This is the 400th episode of the Legalized Freedom podcast, and 2023 marks a decade, 10 years that we've been having these conversations. The first one, 2013, as we just reminded ourselves. So yeah, you could take the floor and get us going.
Thanks, Greg, and also like to say it's very honored to be offered the 400th episode. And like you said, we worked out that 2013, 10 years ago, we first kind of started our conversation. So very apt that we should get here because, I think the conversations parallel also our own research in that, we're always kind of learning as we go along. And I think where we are now is kind of a culmination of everything we've kind of been picking up along the way. To give a brief bio for anyone who may be mildly interested, in my younger years, I call myself an ex-academic. I did work in various institutions around the world, in Prague, in Istanbul, and in England, and a few places, in colleges and finally at universities, and in sociology. was where I ended up in sociology. But I left that in 2008. Yes, the end of 2008. I decided that academia was even then becoming highly controlled and quite false to true educational needs, and I wanted to kind of give my freedom. So I jumped ship and I hopped over at that time to southern Spain, and I decided to become a freelance researcher and writer. And since then, the majority of virtually all my books have been out since then. And just looking at the crossroads between cultural events, the social trends, and human consciousness and thinking patterns, and how they all kind of converge. So that's the big mix, really. These external impacts from society, which I suppose is a bit of my sociological background, with the idea of how does self-development and conscious evolution come about within that mix. And what's this kind of, for some people it's a contestation, but it's also a kind of balance between the inner life and the outer life, and how to kind of get those influences to affect oneself beneficially. So, sometimes I look at more inner development, and sometimes, like the inversion, I look more so on that, I suppose, the external impulses and events which are influencing how we perceive our reality set.
Okay, so the sort of shape of the talk, as I envision it, is we're going to begin with kind of the nature of the reality that we find ourselves in. I mean, in the title of your book, you mentioned a false reality. Then that, in fact, is what we are perceiving. That we're not perceiving the some sort of baseline. We're looking at kind of like scenery, as it were. Like those shop fronts and things that used to set up for the westerns. That look like a town and there's nothing behind them. Talking about the reality construct, we'll use that phrase, the consensus reality. And then we'll move from that physicality into metaphysical realms, I think, which are beginning to look behind the curtain. And then we're going to be talking about transhumanism and artificial intelligence, some of the big trends in technology, but also there's way more to those fields than purely physical. There is a metaphysical dimension. That's an idea that will take many people perhaps by surprise. And then we'll be looking at future trends in all of this, where we're going, potential responses, what we can expect going forward. So this false reality, let's use, I said, reality construct, consensus reality, for people who are perhaps, aware that there's something wrong with the world, that even the world on the television and even maybe the world out of their window, they have this nagging doubts about it, that those doubts may have been amplified by the events of the last few years and the sort of unreality that we all lived through. But consensus meaning kind of what is agreed upon, by more than one person. And that's an interesting concept when it comes to the nature of reality, because if you say to people that things are the way they are because that's what we agree upon, and if we change that, then things would change, well, that sounds like magical nonsense thinking, really. But equally, when you look at the experience of individuals within reality, I think that can indicate something about this reality being a construct. By that, I mean that the subjectivity of reality, or lived experience, perhaps, just let's put it that way. I've often said that none of us live in exactly the same world. We perceive things slightly differently. So there's a contrast between individual perception and mass perception. But perhaps give us, reflecting on what I've just said, some of your thoughts on this reality construct, what it is, and if you don't know what it is, but how it functions and how it affects us. And, for people who are new to these concepts, perhaps orientate them a little bit within that field.
Yeah, sure, Greg. And, I think it's good that you picked up that in recent years, I think it's more, the conversation is easier to have around these subjects because we've had so many major impacts which are kind of shaking our awareness and making us more questioning and more critically aware. So because actually the point of a consensus reality is that because it's consensus, we're actually not aware that we're participating. And I think for most of the time, most people are not completely, cognizant of how much we do. We are complicit in the reality that we are engaging in, because we had this narrative or this this conditioning that the world is full of separate objects and what's out there physically is separate to what, who we are and what we think. We've grown up with this idea that reality is fixed, it's separate from us, and we're just moving around it. We don't realize that actually what a lot of who we are and what we've become gets projected out into our world, which is why if a person's had a radically different life experience, such as a near-death experience or any kind of shock or trauma, they have very quickly different understanding of the world around them. And sometimes you can be speaking with a friend or a family member who at one time was so close to you, perhaps, and yet maybe they've had an experience or a trauma and they seem so far away in their own world because they've shifted their reality. So all the time, a consensus reality is because we are compliant and we give our willingness to accept reality. So first we accept it and then we project it. And how that mechanism happens is through the stories that we are told. Now, if we go back in history, a very kind of large, let's say, a large way of putting it is, say, at one time the narrative was that the world was flat before science got into a different area, or that in terms of astronomy, that the Earth was the center of the universe and then the center of the solar system and everything revolved around us, and then you know what I'm saying. And then you have religious narratives before scientific narratives came along, and these were given to people to give them, say, their worldview. And so when we accept that, and in ages past we accepted it because we didn't have that time individualized education system that we have today, we accepted verbatim a worldview. And then we projected that out, and that's how we saw our reality. Now, of course, that when we went into a kind of from the agrarian stage to the industrial stage, we went into a form of social education, which is also a form of more focused social conditioning. Those narratives had to be put through our educational structures, and therefore had to be enforced in a more kind of concrete way. And now, of course, it's getting to a point where it's becoming quite specific and quite difficult to maintain that consensus reality because of all these different stories coming up and all these different investigations and critical awareness. But before the recent times, largely the masses were given a story, a narrative that changed very seldom. It changed only over major epochs or aeons because life or people's cultural lifestyles were fairly stable. And now, of course, we're quickening in terms of our knowledge base and how we receive information. And that's why we see this kind of splintering, because a lot of people are no longer agreeing in someone else's reality. So, in fact, it's a kind of feedback loop whereby we're provided with information. If we don't question it, we then invest in it as saying that's now my beliefs and my belief system. And that goes into our subconscious, which then dictates our conscious reception of events and how we then frame how we see reality. So within that, you always get little divisions, but no major divisions. But right now, I think the time's quite critical because we're now, getting major divisions in this reality sets and it's becoming splintered, which is why there's a greater force coming out socially, culturally, politically to try and reset the narrative, reset the story, because the older stories have become so fragmented. And that's why we're more or less within what we could call the Great Reset, because there's a struggle, there's a contestation of forces to dominate or own the new narrative which is coming in, Greg.
Yeah, there's kind of like a bifurcation taking place in society and culture, globally, in fact. I mean, I first spotted this really after 9/11. In fact, I made a video in 2020, I think, 2021 maybe, but called COVID 9/11, a warning from history. And I was drawing parallels between what was happening with the pandemic narrative and 9/11. It was another further kind of bifurcation, yet another split, splinter in reality. And it's interesting what's happening where we find ourselves now, coming up to the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. We have this normalization of the abnormal. Anything goes and nothing matters. All of these manifest problems all around us in every dimension of human affairs, but people kind of nothing to see here, just move along and kind of assimilating this and somehow saying this is okay, this is, if not acceptable, then it's to be expected. But simultaneously, more and more people noticing, like a glitch in the matrix, just say, oh, wait, there's something wrong here. There's something, whether it's purely on a surface level of current events, as it were, political, social, economic trends, or whether it's below the surface and just saying there has to be something else going on behind the scenes here. And yet another amplification of that earlier splinter, that bifurcation. And it's like people descending further into unconsciousness, while some other people seem to be, awakening from, a state of slumber. That we will talk about false awakenings in a moment.
Yes, and I think it perhaps now more than a bifurcation, it's becoming splintered and fragmented into many different streams, which is why there's this kind of instability and uncertainty in society. Now, I have to say, consensus reality, the way that is managed, does not necessarily have to be a negative thing. It's a way of socially managing how people work together. If you're in a tribe or a small community, you adhere to a worldview which serves the community. And that's always been the kind of the way it's been put forth. But of course, it's been hijacked a long time ago. So the forces that want to have power over society, of course, took possession and dominance of what narratives they want to put forth. So a consensus reality can work if it serves a community or it serves the group of people who adhere to it. But why I call it the inversion is that these stories that have been told to us and that we imbibe now no longer make sense. So it's a kind of normalized delusion, or what I refer to in chapter 4 as normalized madness. So and a lot of people are now waking up and saying, okay, well, that story I used to kind of believe it, or it used to work kind of, but now it's really crazy. It's not working. And of course, to get to that stage, we've had to have certain impacts. And if you look back in history, they can say, well, these were impacts. So, for example, still the general narrative about, let's say, the World War I, World War II, and Vietnam War, most wars, we believe the kind of historical narrative. But actually now there's been a lot of investigation to say, well, actually, that's not the case. There was other agendas which created that. And, and we can go back again and question, well, the assassination of JFK. At the time, if you questioned it, you were labeled conspiracy theorist, because conspiracy theorist was a term actually created by the CIA to label someone who questioned the assassination of JFK. So that was a wake-up call which kind of triggered a stream of this fracturing of reality. And this gets to an idea of cognitive dissonance, which I touch on in the book. And cognitive dissonance is when events that are impacting you start to no longer synchronize with how you thought the world was or your reality construct. And when these two things appear kind of in dissonance, then it creates this kind of crack, the crack in the egg, so to speak. But you need more than one crack to crack an egg. And so I think, as you mentioned, 9/11 was a huge crack that really broke into our cognitive stability and created cognitive dissonance. And you say, well, the narrative that they told us doesn't make sense. These people with pliers overtook a plane with minimal training, which major pilots came forth and said they couldn't, pilot in that way. And then we've had a whole wave of elements coming from political institutions and, in the World Economic Forum more recently, and of course the pandemic and these kind of social events. And each one has been it can either work to further place someone down the rabbit hole. If a person doesn't want to deal with the cognitive dissonance, they seek the safety. And so that can put someone further down the rabbit hole of illusion. But on the other side, it can actually create more cracks in our reality construct. And eventually, this is going to start splitting open. And I think that's what's happening with, as I portray in the Inversion. Now, a lot of people are realizing that our reality narrative that we adhered to or that was told to us is falling apart. And that's a very constructive place to find ourselves, because we don't want to build a house with the old materials. We need to take a step forward and kind of reconstruct our own sense of self from this kind of splintering.
You mentioned, about how these stories that were told that about the way things are doesn't bear scrutiny, but we assimilate these things and then we project them out again, and they spread, like a virus, if you will, throughout the collective, and then this is where this mass delusion comes from. But of course, we need, human race has always needed myths and stories. These are the things that carry culture forward, and it's just part of how we relate to the wider cosmos. It's always been very vital in that sense. And of course, in the modern age of scientific materialistic age, myth has become synonymous with untruth, which of course it's not really the meaning of the word at all. Nevertheless, in this denial by materialists of the power of myth and of stories and of our wider place in a greater holistic system, we still have to have that function fulfilled in another way. In the Inversion, you talk about Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, about image stories, and he writes about the 5 functions of these things. So in that sort of benevolent or benign mythological human past, where we have these things that the functions that these stories serve and the different dimensions of our culture, we have, ironically enough, a simulacrum, a mimicry, a simulation of these things under the guise of a society and a culture that doesn't believe in mythology or the importance of any non-material or spiritual dimension to human life.
So true, and mythology has played a central part of our social cultural heritage and of humanity. But of course, there's the truer path and the lesser path, and I refer to our reality construct as a lesser reality, because there is no one reality in this realm. There are reflections and aspects of reality. So I call this a domination of the lesser reality. Now, mythology, a lot of mythological stories are based on archetypes, and Joseph Campbell talked about that and was very, very clear on his expositions. And we could say that a lot of those archetypes came from the noetic world, or what Plato called the world of ideas, what we may call the imaginal realm, as in Persian Sufism. And there's a lot of traditions talk about this realm of the pure idea, which then kind of filters down through our stories and mythologies into this lesser realm. And that's why a lot of wisdom traditions have used stories, tales, mythologies, because they are ideal mediums of transmission to put across certain information and knowledge. And through our mythologies, we got knowledge of how to behave. We had our heroes, and we had our hero's journey, going through the underworld and having the life experience, and then coming through to the light and taking our wisdom back to the community. That's the hero's journey. But along the way, what I'm pointing to is that some of these mythologies or stories became hijacked, and they got turned around, inverted into control mechanisms. So some mythologies are control mechanisms, and some structures, which, let's say, could be social religious structures, can be tweaked to become almost trauma structures that are then used for social cultural modification of managing people. So, you see, previously mythologies were used to control external behavior, and external behavior was controlled very brutally. The king or queen, i.e. the head of state, had jurisdiction over the subject's body, and if you went against the consensus rule, then you'd be hung up, or put in a town square into stocks. So you were tortured physically, because that was a visceral kind of social management. Now, over time, as social cultural structures and humanity has developed, they don't get away with such brutal physical management. Not so much. I mean, in some cultures it still carries on, of course. And In the more industrialized countries, the holy grail is to socially manage people by getting into our heads internally, because external management of behavior only kind of goes so far. And this is why in the last few decades, especially with the uptake and advancement of technology, which is key, the holy grail is in their sight, or so they feel in terms of management, to get into our heads. And that's why it's so much more important to critically observe how these agendas and strategies operate, because we want to protect the last dominion of our sovereign self, which is how we think and feel in our inner private life.
Yeah, and of course, getting into our heads has been a thing, the modern era of propaganda, Bernays. I mean, really, I've got my earliest book on the subject, William Sargent's The Battle for the Mind, which was published in the 1950s. So this coming from a military secret service kind of, applications that soon became applied commercially, as where all these things are, but, politically, socially. And so that sort of manipulation has been going on. Of course, it existed prior to the 1950s in modern communications, but it's really ramped up since then. And technology has facilitated that, those levels of control and, of sort of psychic penetration. Where we find ourselves now, you were talking about, cracks appearing in the consensus reality. If we think of materialism really not just as, in two dimensions, as a cosmology, that matter is all that matters, it's all there is. There are no non-material realms. The story, that sort of Darwinist scientific story of human origins, and there's no purpose to life. Basically, it's one big accident, and when we die, that's the end of it. So that one way of looking at the world, life, the universe, and everything through that lens, but also materialism as a lifestyle. Acquisitive, buying things, all against a background of, as I said, mythology and spirituality, and all that just fading away as superstitious things from the past that we have no need of. But at this time, we find that sort of materialism breaking down. People are not doing as well as they used to in material terms. It's harder to survive, financially. It's harder to do well in, on those purely materialistic terms. And this is where the Great Reset and the technocracy comes in as a sort of way to manage that, so to speak, to manage our expectations downwards, but still withholding the promise of a bright technological future. It's really a way of spinning the materialist fantasy of everyone having, 2 cars and a semi-detached house and air conditioning, everyone in the world having this stuff, spinning that, the going away of that as positive, as all living in pods and eating Z-bugs because it's good for the environment. And actually, you'll own nothing and be happy, because ironically enough, materialism is now saying that, well, material things are not really what's important. But you can see that in simplistic terms as a technocratic management of, energy and economic spiraling crises within the material world.
Oh, for sure. And I think that's a critical point, Greg, is that what's happening now is that we're seeing that there's a shift over a different narrative of the material realm and the material path. And as you said, the old way of seeing materialism was this, I have a job and I'll work until I retire and get a pension. And that's coming apart because all the older structures are coming apart now. And, those groups who are social engineering the narrative, they're very well aware of this. In fact, if you want to know what they're thinking, you just have to listen to one of the mouthpieces, Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian. He made a point by saying that in the future, people are going to find themselves increasingly irrelevant. And that means they're going to lose their sense of purpose. And that's critical because as the industrialization changes and all the whole shifts coming of automation and technology, of course, all the industry demographics change as well. So they're very well aware of this, which is they've framed it in the fourth industrial revolution, which I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of. So what they've done, of course, and if you stay with that material crumbling paradigm, what it comes to is nihilism. And there's a lot of, we see that nihilism coming up now because, people are saying, where's my purpose for the future? What's tangible for my future? And so now they're being very clever about this. And transhumanism is what I call in the book a material fallacy, because they're introducing this digital or digitized future. Then they're kind of positing it as it's not material, it's beyond materialism. Because if it's material, you can touch it. But if you go into the metaverse, it's all digital and you can't touch it. So it's beyond materialism. It's the new future where we need to go to. But for me, I compare it to that wonderful film, The Inception, I think in 2010, with DiCaprio, and about when, these people go into the mind of a sleeper and they have to access first, a higher layer of the dreamer's mind, or rather the outer layer, and then keep going to the next layer of the dreamer's mind, the next layer, and to get deeper and deeper into the layer of the dreaming. For me, that kind of foreshadows this material fallacy, because just because it's not solid, in fact, it's more material because it's being constructed by the machinic architecture. Now, machinic architecture is being built by either humans or machines. It runs on certain types of fuel or electricity. It creates algorithms. It's a material construct which then projects a kind of immaterial environment and architecture that we move through. So now we're being maneuvered through these digital electronic architectures, which Snowden calls the architectures of oppression, Edward Snowden. And so we think, we're moving to the next phase of human evolution. But actually, it's entrapping us into greater materiality. But we don't see it because it's not solid. We can't just tap on it like a table. So actually, we don't see it coming. And transhumanism then is built upon this. It's built upon the further extension, what I call extended reality. There's a chapter in the book called Extended Reality, where we think it's presented as the next stage of evolution. But what it is, I think of it as a kind of materialistic cul-de-sac. Because once you're going down the transhumanist route, you're actually then moving away from this metaphysical, transcendental element, which is inherent to the human and is important to the human evolution. So the material fallacy, I think, is a greater kind of encapsulation of humanity in an encampment or architecture where materiality is still the basis, but we don't see it because the dominant narrative has changed the vocabulary.
Yeah, within that idea of a trap being presented as an escape, then you get into the ideas, the concept of the demiurge, of like, we finally peeled away all the layers of reality and got to the core. But actually, it's not that at all. It's just presented that way, and it's there many fictional narratives work with this idea, don't they? That just when you thought you'd found the answer, then there was, but there was something else beyond that which you couldn't see, and is that a never-ending, eternal regression of never quite being able to get to the core of what it is that you're seeking. We'll return to transhumanism again very shortly, but speaking in terms of so-called physical reality again for a moment, the technocratic thing I see at the minute, it is having interesting impacts, just trends within society, I say, political, economic, in terms of energy and societal changes, all of this huge mix of stuff, everything you can think of, from like energy, the movements from, governments to sort of an environmental front through to, outbreak of war, all of these manifestations are ultimately of the same type of neurosis, psychosis, dysfunction. And the technocratic idea of, scaling back our material expectations, but that being spun as actually this is still positive materialism, it's still a bright future, what I referred to earlier, that's a form of creating more physical dependence on the system, more physical dependence on the kind of matrix system in terms of your day-to-day needs, as it were. And if you think in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it indicates that as a human being moves up and has their physical needs more and more catered for, and they're more comfortable, Not that they actually then slip into a coma, far from it, but that then makes room, or should make room, for self-development, and higher pursuits, and to look beyond just day-to-day survival. So what I see happening now, and from my own personal experience, I've even had several subscribers to Legalize Freedom, who pay for, access to all the material, cancel subscriptions and say, just at the minute, I need to focus on just, keeping food on the table type thing. At the minute, blah, 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 I need to do this. So that, to me, that's very regressive. And of course I understand, but that's this thing in action, create this physical dependence and a psychological dependence in a way, and cutting off people's options. Now, of course, there are ways around all of that. You don't need these material things in order to go within your own mind. Far from it, as as all sorts of ascetic traditions prove. But in the societies we live in, it's perceived that way. Oh, well, if I become homeless, then I'm not going to be able to do any self-development.
Yeah, some good points there, Greg. And you first mentioned about talking about the demiurge. I'd like to come back to that, but first off, I'd like to address what you talked about, this hierarchy of needs.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com